Hello YouTube, my name's Rob and welcome to my YouTube channel. With Big Friendly Gaming, I'm hoping to share my love of the miniature wargaming and miniature painting hobby. I'm hoping I can share some tips and tricks. You could potentially learn a few things from me, or at the very least, be entertained for the few minutes I have your attention. Thank you so much for spending however much time you choose to spend with me today, and let's get to the video. Today, I'm going to be taking on a miniature painting challenge. I'm going to be challenging myself to paint an entire Age of Sigmar army in one weekend. For January, like many hobbyists, I am excited about the idea of new year, new army. Getting something fresh on the table, getting away from the tried and true army lists and the same painting you've been doing for potentially many years. Like many other hobbyists, I have a main army that I've been really excited about in the past, but I think with the new year, it was time to get excited about something new. For me, starting a new army is equal parts exciting and nerve-wracking. I'm excited about trying out new paint schemes and getting a new play style on the table, but I'm also nervous about having to build 50, 60, 70 models, pay for them, paint them before I can do that. I wanted to challenge myself to get over that hump as quick as possible and challenge myself to paint an entire army in as short of a window as possible. Some of my favorite content on YouTube is miniature painting army challenges, where people take the large, overwhelming challenge that is painting an entire Warhammer army and compress it into a short period of time. Some of my favorite YouTubers like Ninjon and Vince Venturella have done this challenge in the past, and I think I've watched those videos tens, if not hundreds of times while painting my own armies. I thought there'd be no better way to get started on YouTube than making the type of content that I like to watch. I'm going to be challenging myself through this to paint an entire, just over 2,000 point army for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. The army I'm going to be painting is for one of Games Workshop's newest refreshed army lines, the Cities of Sigmar. The Cities of Sigmar are an amazing aesthetic within the larger Age of Sigmar fantasy setting. In a world with bloodthirsty ogres, fire-breathing dragons, and the literal god of death, there are just human dudes, and sometimes they're dogs, fighting with swords and guns, just desperately trying to hang on. I think it's a really interesting and fresh change of pace from my other army. For this army, I'll be following the color scheme for the free city of Misthaven. Given how short time I have to do this challenge, I wanted to make sure I came in prepared. I developed 2 test models to test out the paint scheme and refine the steps I'm using in the process. The goal was to reduce the number of paints I'm using, reduce the number of steps I'm taking, and really get it down to an exact mathematical formula of how I can pump these guys out quick and easily. I made 2 test models, a Free Guild Cavalier and a Free Guild Fusilier. I'll describe the paints that I use on this challenge throughout, but they're all listed also in the description below. So the challenge. I have 3 rules. 1, I'll only paint from Friday when I finish work around 5 o'clock till Sunday at midnight. I have a day job, I need to get back to it, but I've been able to carve out a weekend, thanks to permission from my wife, in order to take on this challenge. 2, the models have all been assembled, based, and primed in the weeks leading up to the weekend. For this army, I have a lot of models I need to paint. There are 5 models in the Free Guild Command Corps, 1 Alchemite Warforger, 1 Battle Mage, 1 Free Guild Cavalier Marshal, 2 models, the Free Guild General and his Squire, 4 models as part of the Celestial Huracanum and their crew. I have 21 Fusiliers, 10 Wilder Corps, including their dogs, 20 Steel Helms, Pontifex Sinistra, and 10 Free Guild Cavaliers. In total, I have 76 models to paint over the course of the weekend. Rule 3, these models need to get done to a battle-ready standard. For those of you who don't attend Warhammer tournaments, typically battle-ready means based and 3 colors on the model. I need to make sure that even if I go down in flames and don't finish this challenge, that this army can see play on the tabletop. So I've structured my workflow around 3 steps. 1, we're going to call the layering or battle ready stage. I'm going to go through all of these models and I'm going to get their base tones on all the models. I'm not highlighting, I'm not shading. My goal is to get solid, as opaque as possible base coats on these models in a shorter period of time. In the second stage, I'm going to use oil washes to bring variety and depth to the paint job. In the final stage, I'll go back and for select miniatures, characters, and key points, I'm going to spend a little bit of time providing some tender love and care on highlights, details, edge highlights, the things that are really going to make the models pop. At this step, I'm also going to finish up the bases and do any sort of final touches that I think are necessary to finally and officially call the army done. On Friday, around 5:30, I wrap up work and get some dinner with my wife. Friday's really not the day I'm expecting to get a ton done. I really want to just focus on getting a head start on some of the characters that I think deserve some special attention while I have maximum focus and before I start getting into the grind of painting out each of these 70 plus models. I begin across all the army laying down base coats of the metals. Most of these units are covered in armor. Even the horses are covered in armor, so I wanted to use the airbrush at this point to speed up the process and get some really good, clean metals applied to all these armor. To lay down the metals, I lay down a coat of Vallejo metal color steel through the airbrush, covering the entire model over a black primer, and then I highlight with Vallejo metal color silver, focusing on the top, let's say third of the model, giving that highlight, focusing on a top-down approach. Using the airbrush here saves me a ton of time versus doing it by hand. But if you don't have an airbrush, you could do a very similar effect using brushes. I would probably recommend dry brushing in this case. Using a large makeup brush from Amazon, something just cheap, you could dry brush on a steel or whatever sort of dark silver metallic paint you have, and then go back and do it again, focusing on the upper part of the miniature with a brighter silver to get the similar effect. It'll give you a similar effect. Actually, it's something I find may actually look a little bit better because dry brushing really adds a lot of grittiness up front, but it does take a little bit longer. There are some models in the line that aren't covered in armor. There are things like wizards and the Wilder Core Hunter that are more covered in robes or leather garb. For them, I skip them. I'm going to do all of their base coats by hand. Once I get metal coats down on all of the models, I move on to the layering stage. I put all of my colors on a wet palette and start blocking colors off one at a time across an entire unit. I paint one unit at a time to give myself a small endorphin hit of seeing a single model or a single unit going from started to complete. I think there's probably an argument for doing more of an assembly line where you do a step across the entire 76 model army, but for me, that was very daunting. I wanted to hit one thing at a time so that I could see it progress and be able to check things off my list. For me, those micro goals, those micro wins are a really big part of enjoying this experience and feeling like I'm making progress throughout the challenge. I use Bering blue from scale 75 for the shields and some of the cloth elements to add pops of color throughout the models. I use this color because it's an inky, desaturated blue with a little bit of green in it that I think reflects the Nordic tone that I want to get out of this Misthaven color scheme. For the belts, boots, leathers, all the other soft elements of the model, I use a variety of blacks, grays, and browns in order to create some contrast across the models. I put 4 colors on my wet palette: black, gray, olive brown, ivory, and mahogany on my wet palette. I use these throughout the models to pick out leather gloves, belts, cloaks, anything I need to color in a neutral tone. I try to have some consistency across the models. I use mahogany for the gloves, for instance, in order to bring a warm tone to contrast the blue. But for a lot of the models, I'm kind of being random with it. Some of them have black belts, some of them have brown belts. Creating little bits of variation helps bring the army together because I'm using the same colors, but it also helps to have each of the individual models have some visual interest and stand out as the motley crew that the army is. Throughout this process, I'm not shading, I'm not highlighting. I'm really just focused on getting clean applications of layers across the models. Wherever possible, I'm using thicker paint than you might normally use in order to avoid having to take multiple steps. I learned this trick from Ninjon, who, when doing his army painting challenge of the OCR Bone Reapers, decided that he wasn't going to futz around with thin paints, and it really does save you a lot of time. In addition to that tip, use the biggest brush you can find. I grabbed an Artist Loft size, I think it was a size 5. This allowed me to avoid going back and forth to the wet palette, just loading up that giant brush and hitting as many areas as I could. At the end of Friday night, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. Honestly, going into this challenge, I thought I was just going to absolutely crush it. I've seen my favorite creators do these online. They always seem to manage to get it through looking really great, but when you start to do it yourself, it is daunting. When you get those 70 plus models on the table, all primed, and you start working on them, you lose momentum and excitement really quickly. I got as much done as I could today. I spent time focused on the characters that I was really excited about. The Free Guild Cavalier Marshal, for one, is like one of my favorite models. The Free Guild Command Corps, really interesting variety of things. I spent the time I needed on those characters, being very careful about their layers. I spent the time getting the opacity that I was looking for on those models. And then I realized I had less than half the models through step 1. Tomorrow, I'm going to really need to focus on getting through that layering stage faster on all the rest of the models. I cannot be as particular and careful as I was today. I still have more than 40 models with no paint on them aside from primer at this point. And I really need as much time as I can on Saturday to apply oil washes and give them a fighting chance to dry before I move into step 3, hopefully on Sunday, so I can finish up this army. Saturday morning, I'm feeling good. I got a good night's sleep, made sure I got my full 8 hours. I should start painting around 9 a.m. after having breakfast and taking the dog for a walk. I get moving immediately on the layering stage for the remaining models. This stage, I cannot stress how long it takes. I'm moving as quick as I can. I'm using every trick in the book, from my big brush to thicker paint. But when trying to remain neat and tidy and build opacity, it just takes time. Especially for colors like Ivory, it's going to take multiple coats in order to get at least a acceptable level of opacity across the models before you go into the oil wash stage. With that, at 3 o'clock, I have layers down on the entire army. It really dawns on me at this point that I may have bitten off a bit more than I can chew. 76 models is more models than I painted in all of 2023. I'm an Ochre player. I'm used to armies with 20 models tops. The good news is I passed my first challenge. These models are all now battle ready. They all have 3 colors on them, and they have bases. Although the bases are just black currently, these could go to a tournament and be perfectly acceptable for competitive play. But that's not the challenge. I want to make these models look really good. I want to make sure that they stand out on the tabletop. Before moving on to step 2, I want to apply all the water slide transfers. These new Cities of Sigmar models come with the symbols and emblems that go on the shield, banners, and horses of the models. To help with this, I'm going to use 2 products, Microsol and Microset, 2 classic additives that help applying with water slide decals. I've linked a great video from Vince Venturella in the description on how to use these products. He explains way better than I ever could on what they are and how to use them for this purpose. Before moving on, I do put a bit of gloss varnish on each of the decals so that they don't move. The gloss varnish adds a little bit of rigidity and makes sure that they aren't going to reactivate or slide with any of the future painting steps. I'll make sure I go back later with a ultra matte varnish and make sure to kill any shine before calling this army done. With the army painted and all the decals applied, we're going to move on to step 2, debeautification. In this step, we're going to use oil washes to bring to life this army. Now I hear you. Oil washes can be a little bit scary, but they don't have to be. Oil washes you can pick up from your local Michaels or whatever craft store you have available to you. For this scheme, I'm using 2 oil paints, Lamp Black and Sienna from Winsor & Newton's Winton line, a line of oil paints that should be widely available, and I personally got it at Michael's near my house. I'm going to mix these with odorless mineral spirits to get to a consistency that's similar to 2% milk, a thick, fluid paint. I mix the oil paint in a ratio of about 5:1 black to sienna. The goal of sienna is only to provide a little bit of warmth. The next step is really scary. We're going to take all those models and all that hard work we applied earlier, and I'm going to apply this oil wash just across them all. I'm going to cover up all that work, and it's really going to take a bit of professional courage at this step to make sure that I don't feel like I've ruined these models. The goal is to get an even coat across all of our minis. I don't want any thick, heavy elements that are going to obscure details, and I don't want it to be too wet that it's running off of the main surfaces. Once applied, I need to wait about 3 to 5 hours for the paint to partially cure. To do this, we take a makeup sponge, some Q-tips, and mineral spirits. and we lift the oil paint from the raised edges of the miniatures by dragging those, either the makeup sponge or the Q-tips across the model. We're not trying to get all the paint. We're focusing on lifting paint from the raised pieces and those parts of the model that would naturally have highlights. Doing so creates natural shadows and highlights in a way that you just couldn't do in this quick of a time with a traditional paintbrush and shading methods. When dipped in mineral spirits, the makeup sponge and the Q-tips act as erasers. They pull up the oil paint and leave it in the recesses. You're getting natural highlights, toned, midtones, and shades through this process, and you're saving a ton of time versus traditional miniature painting techniques. My afternoon is spent applying these washes to all of the models and slowly going through an assembly line, getting them all covered in this black tar-like substance, and then one by one going through with my magic erasers and lifting the paint from their highlights and shadows. It's amazing to see how quickly this effect can bring to life these miniatures. You go from solid, somewhat opaque layers, I definitely didn't get them to where I wanted to in all the models, to models that really have volumes and look like they exist within the world. Each of the colors is shaded with the same environmental shadow color, so it really helps them feel cohesive within the world. One lesson learned is I probably should have left the models before I came back in with the magic eraser step. For some of the models, the paint fully hadn't even partially cured, and I was lifting up a lot more paint than I wanted to. I think it still worked out. The thinner parts of the paint that I was picking up with the makeup sponges and the Q-tips ran into the recesses, and I still got some shadow effect. But if you can, you probably want to wait closer to 6 to 8 hours before going back to lift the paint. At about 11:30, I finished the stage. I have every single model in the army now through the oil washing stage, and I think the army actually looks really great as is. My next big challenge is hoping these are actually going to dry on time. Oil paints are great for what they can do, which is their working time and your ability to lift them off using techniques like this, but they are going to take a while to dry. It's already 11 o'clock and I really only have tomorrow because of the challenge. I need to stop painting now and give these models as long as I possibly can to give them a chance to set up. At least enough that I can do the final step, which is focusing on some additional highlights and getting the bases done tomorrow. I get a good night's sleep and start my painting day a little bit later than the day before. I get started around 10 a.m. because I'm trying to give the models as much time as possible to dry. When I hit the desk, I do find the oil paints are still not entirely cured, but they're enough for me to hit some of the targeted highlight areas around the raised edges where I've removed a lot of the paint. During step 3, I'm focused on highlights and bringing to life elements that are important on these models. I don't want to highlight the entire model. I'm not trying to edge highlight every single blade or do anything too fancy, but what I am doing is going back and emphasizing highlights close to the faces and in the top 1/3 of the model, trying to draw the attention of the viewer to the face and make sure that things like banners and big capes, anything that's a focal point of the miniature, gets a little bit of extra TLC. I spend the majority of the morning going through all of these models, one by one, identifying where can I add a bit of highlights, where is the oil paint not necessarily fully cured, and where do I need to stay away from. And I do my best to apply highlights to especially the characters and the banners of the army, the things that I think are really the most important pieces to salvage at this point. Ultimately, this step saves me from myself. I probably would have spent the entire day on Sunday going through and trying to add highlights to the faces and edges around the armor, around the faces of each of these models. But because the oil wash didn't fully set up, I was forced to make a tough call. For the steel helms, free guild fusiliers, and most of the rank and file that I didn't get done until later in the day, I call them done. I think they look great as is, and I can't do anything with their current state of the oil paint, so I need to really just give them time to dry. For the characters that I got done earlier in the day, I can actually get a few extra highlights done in a few key areas, and where I need to, I go back in with a dry makeup sponge and wipe away any partially dried oil paint from the raised edges so I can get a little bit of extra detail in them. But again, I'm not hitting every area of the model, which forces me to be very strategic in the way that I'm applying highlights. I finished painting around 1 o'clock on Sunday on all the highlights I want to get done. I'm really limited ultimately in what I'm able to do, but I'm happy with the result I got done with the brush. The last step of the army is going to be putting them in the scene by finishing their bases. By this point, my wet palette is a mess. It's covered in blues, browns, grays from all the painting that I've been doing all weekend. I don't want to fight that. I'm actually going to make use of all that color in order to set the bases. I use the dark browns and blacks on my palette in order to create base coats to paint over the existing bases where there's potentially a little bit too much metal color overspray from the earlier steps. If the models ultimately mostly are covered in brown tones and things like that from my stakes I made earlier, I don't fight it. I'm going to leave that on there and use that as my base coat. I then use the colors that are already on my palette, the grays and the ivories, in order to create tones, brighter tones of browns, and I dry brush on those bases to create some variation in texture. Using the colors that are already on the palette has the added benefit of making my models feel like they already exist within the world. I'm not bringing in new tones that may clash with the existing ones. It's using that same neutral color set and make sure that there's harmony between the bases that I'm building and the characters that I created. Once the bases are painted, I add some winter tufts of yellow grass to the miniatures with some super glue. I use a mix of small and larger tufts depending on the size of the model to create a tundra type environment that the models are in. As a last step, I want to create some modeling snow to really help bring some whites that are bold and contrast with the darkness of the color scheme we've been working with. I mix golden heavy modeling paste with some Vallejo color shift paint in an attempt to add some sparkle. Lesson learned, this really didn't do anything, so I would suggest skipping the color shift paint. As a final step, I apply a little bit of that snow effect paste to the tufts themselves. At this point, I'm functionally done. The models are painted, I have the bases done, I got through all the 3 steps I wanted to, but it's only 3 o'clock. I made a really good time today, mostly because I couldn't take that step 3 as far as I wanted to. So I could stop, I could declare victory and take the rest of the afternoon. But let's see if we can punch these up a bit. First, I'm going to take a super saturated turquoise paint from the Army Painter line in order to create some visual interest on these models. I take that turquoise and I thin it down to a glaze consistency. Using an airbrush, I hit each of the models and bases with a quick faded blue from behind. This really helps bring the miniatures together and creates another point of visual interest on the army when you're looking at them on a tabletop. I also use this color to create a glow effect on the Celestial Huracanum, hitting the core of the mechanism and gradually adding ivory to create a glowing, radiant effect on that model. It's about 5 p.m. after this stage. I have a little bit of time left, so I want to do one more interesting step before calling it a day. As I went through the model process, I noticed that a lot of the Cities of Sigmar models have lanterns, torches, candles, other little magical bits and bobs that are just screaming for a little bit of love and attention. What I'm going to do is apply some very quick object source lighting effects using an airbrush to the models. For the OSL effect, I choose orange as it works for the fire and lamp elements that are a part of these models, and it contrasts really nicely with the blues and turquoise I've used in the model so far. I take some ivory and I mix it with fluorescent orange from Golden Fluid Acrylic and clear orange from Vallejo Model Color, putting it in my airbrush and sparingly applying it to lay down an undercoat on the torches, lanterns, candles, orbs, and smoke on some key models. For each of those elements, I hit them 2 or 3 times depending on the size of the object, slowly building up that powder orange effect with the more opacity closer to the source of the light itself. I then come back with a mix of fluorescent orange and clear orange, covering up each of those areas that I built up before with the ivory mixture, bringing back that saturated warmth, and that orange glow effect really comes through. I love how this ended up looking. I love how the orange interacts with the turquoises and blues from the previous stages. It really helps make some of these really cool miniatures pop on the tabletop and adds a ton to the look of the army. With that step, my challenge is done. I've finished a full Warhammer Age of Sigmar army in a weekend. I used every trick I had in the book to get there. It was definitely not an easy task. I fully underestimated how long this would take. My back is sore, my butt is sore. I've been sitting in this chair for, 40 hours at this point. But there's a full army that is now painted and ready to see it play on the tabletop. I'm thrilled with how these came up. I applied a lot of tips and tricks that I've never done at this sort of scale. Maybe on one-off models, but never across a full army. Are they going to win a painting competition? Do the individual models stand up to scrutiny? No, there's definitely some roughness around the edges. I didn't get to do as much highlighting as I maybe wanted to do, but as a cohesive unit on the tabletop, I think they look great, and I think they're the best army I've ever painted. Some closing thoughts and lessons learned from this experience. This hobby can be really exciting, but it can also be really draining. We often find ourselves with big backlogs of things that we want to get to and really great ideas, but don't have a way to execute. Hopefully this gives you a roadmap for getting models on the table and gives you some permission to get away from thinking that every model has to be perfect. Because really, as long as you have a plan and you come with a bit of an approach, once they're in a big ensemble on a tabletop, they're going to look great. And nobody's going to notice if you missed a small detail or didn't paint underneath a bolter or a shield. With that, this comes to the end of the video. Thanks so much for spending however much time you chose to spend with me today. This is entirely experimental. I'm not trying to accomplish anything with YouTube. I wanted to take the chance to talk about the hobby that I really enjoy, hopefully share some tips and tricks, and learn a bit about this industry and making videos and editing and things like that. I want to do a couple of acknowledgements here at the end quickly before signing off. One, a lot of what I shared today comes from some of my favorite hobbyists, and it would be a disservice not to mention them in this video. Ninjon and Vince Venturella are two amazing YouTubers that I think I've consumed almost every piece of content they've put out over the last 2 or 3 years. Highly recommend them for our hobbyists who are learning, who either getting in or trying to elevate their painting experience, or are just interested in learning more about the game of Age of Sigmar. I don't think I've missed a Warhammer Wednesday since getting into the hobby. If you have any feedback or ideas for other videos, leave them in the comment section. At this point, I don't care about likes or subscribes. I'm really just trying to have fun. So anything that I can potentially do and make sense for me, I'll give it a shot. With that, I'm going to call this a video. Thank you for spending your time with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned something or you were at least entertained. Remember to be kind, and I'll see you next time.